Thanks for having me again. I will speak about a problem, the non-locality problem, which concerns foundations of temporal consciousness or perceptual experience. Not responding. Who's competent with this?
Byron. Just click with the mouse and then it works.
Oh.
Just click it once.
Okay, good. So this is a new problem, so I will introduce it by recourse to a visual example. This will be the first part. The second part will be to contextualize it, bring it into the context of philosophy of temporal experience for the last 100 years or so, and then I will propose my own solution. So just for an outline to see what's coming. So the problem concerns the tension between two initially plausible assumptions, P1 and P2. These are just statements of these assumptions I will explain them in a moment. So P1 is what I call the local temporal horizon. There's an experienced temporal evolution occurs only through changes on short time scales. So there is something special in our perceptual experiences. When I say experience, I mean conscious perceptual states that concerns short time scale. This is the first thesis. And the second thesis, which is equally plausible prima facie, is what I call the non-local temporal order. And the thesis is, the assumption is experienced temporal evolution has a temporal order. And this temporal order is a strict linear order that is insensitive to time scale, which is what makes it non-local. So I will introduce this problem now by recourse to an example, which is very simple and I think fairly clear, so that we get a grip on the problem, right? And then we'll go to this. So we'll show you a process of color change. And this process of color change will be a square changing in color in the following way. That's the example. But I just, did it change? That's the point, it did. So I just showed you 50 slides. This took about 20 seconds. This is a temporal experience that gave you just a visual experience as of a process of over 20 seconds. And what you experienced was a very slow change in color from a rich orange to a more pale orange. And the point about this is that this is designed for your experience of this color change to be, through the entire process, just noticeable. So this is a technical term in naturalistic philosophy of perception and cognitive science, just noticeable difference. So just above the threshold of noticeability. So you may even have missed it, and Byron asked the right question, did it change? It did, and you saw it because it was entirely smooth and it went lighter, but it was just noticeable. And the entire process, from the beginning to the end, was such that any color change in this process was just noticeable. So none of them was obvious. So that it's just obvious and easily noticeable that this is color change. Now compare this sequence of color states over time that I just showed you with a sequence of the same states, but now spatially arranged from left to right. So suppose I print out these color sheets and arrange them in a gallery wall from left to right, all 50. Now I can't do this, I don't have enough space, but here is just a few of them, right? So this was the rich one we started with. This was the light one we ended up with, and a bit of few in between. So compare the two. It makes no difference whether I just have these 6 or all 50 on the wall. Doesn't matter, because you look at this, visually, it's obvious that there's a change in color, that there's a difference in color. It's just obvious. So you're not going to miss it. Look at it, you're not going to miss it. There's obvious difference in the orange. To the right, it's just much paler, much lighter than on the left. So in the same sequence, so the same states, in a spatial sequence involving the same states, yield an easily noticeable color difference. But not in the temporal case. In the temporal case, it's easy to miss because any change in color, any color difference is just noticeable. No color difference is obvious. So I'm going to call the situation in the temporal case one in which there is something special about short durations between color states. There is something special about them because it seems that our color states are what I call perceptually comparable only across short time scales, only across short duration. The reason why this is illustrated by this case is that if the states in the temporal sequence were perceptually comparable across longer time scales, the whole 20 seconds, it would just be obvious that there's a color difference. But it isn't, because you nearly miss it. Now, in the spatial situation, our color states, even all 50 of them, are perceptually comparable, not just across short distance, but across long distance. Right? Each adjacent states have very, very small difference in color, are just noticeable, but these differences add up across space, so you can just immediately see that the further apart, you can perceptually compare them, and it's immediately obvious that they're different. But they can't be perceptually compared across long time scales. In the temporal case, that means there's something special about short time scales, and that's temporal locality. It seems that in our perceptual experience of the temporal sequence, there is an evolution of this color process in short steps. And because the short steps are so similar, the whole thing remains just noticeable. In the spatial case, it's not local, there is no local horizon, so it's obvious perceptually. This is a very clear difference between the temporal case and spatial case. And this is just a phenomenon. This illustrates the first assumption that there's something special about short time scales, that there's a local temporal horizon in the experience, the perceptual experience, this visual experience, through which this color process evolves. So it seems that it always just happens within a brief change. And since that's so small, it's you nearly miss it. It's just not obvious. Got it? So why is that problematic? Why is there a problem about this? This is just the first assumption. It's very natural and it's illustrated by this. So what is there a problem? You just had, and I did too, a 20-second temporal experience of a color process. So in one temporal experience, you visually experienced a process that took about 20 seconds. Now that sounds completely natural. All color states that you visually experience form a sequence, a unique and consistent temporal sequence. We would all intuitively agree with that. You just saw this process just went through, there were no gaps. There were no gaps. You didn't slip out of consciousness at any point. You're alert, you're awake. So what's that sequence? How do we understand that sequence? So the standard view of what that sequence consists in, and when I say the standard view, I mean the standard view in elementary order theory is that this sequence of states is a strict linear order, or strict total order. Yes. The strict linear order has these properties. So it's an order on a set. In our case, it's a set of states. Okay? ABC in the set, any set. And these are four properties of the angle bracket stands for the earlier relation or precedence. It's the ordinary relation. And these are the properties, right? First, that for any of those, it's not the case that it comes before itself. So it's irreflexive. It's not the case that if A comes before B, then B also comes before A. So if A comes before B, then it's not the case B comes before A. So it's asymmetric. So no two states come before each other. And then there's transitivity. If A comes before B and B before C, like A earlier than B and B earlier than C, then A is earlier than C. Very obvious, right? And the fourth one is important for this to be a linear, is that for any two states have to be comparable, right? So they're either one's before the other or the other's before the first, right? So it's not that it's kind of open how they are ordered. So they're on a line, and the line doesn't go around in the circle. That's a strict linear order. It's completely standard. So let's put our states that we experience. So now we have this perceptual content. You saw all these states. They have a strict linear order. Here's the earlier than relation. So there's something really important for our purposes about this precedence or earlier than relation, the angle bracket. This is just a standard part of a strict linear order. Take a state 0, the one on the left, and then take state 1, the one right next to it. So state 0 is earlier than state. State 0 is also earlier than state 37. So this earlier than relation between state 0 and state 1 is exactly the same order relation as the one between state 0 and state 37. There's no difference in their ordering that has anything to do with how close they are together. So the order is non-local and for temporally non-local in fun sense, it's completely insensitive to time scale. So it just doesn't matter whether little time passes between them or a lot of time passes between them. Their order is exactly the same. So the order in the sequence between state 0 and state 37 is exactly the same as the order between state 0 and state 1. So, in fact, this linear sequence is exactly the same as the spatial one in that respect from left to right. It's the same. They're really isomorphic. This ordering from left to right, the standard order is a strict linear order from left to right. It doesn't matter how close they are together, right? This to the left of behaves just as earlier than, so structurally the temporal order is the same from earlier to later as the spatial order from left. But in the spatial case, states across longer distances are just as perceptually comparable. So if you have this ordering, you can just see that there is a color difference. But if the temporal order is just structurally the same, you should just see the same easy difference in color. But you don't. So the non-local temporal order goes against the local temporal device. So once again, so here are the two principles again, and that's our problem. And it's completely general problem. So this isn't an objection to any view. It's a general philosophical problem. Both assumptions are plausible. So we saw that there's something special about short time scales. We don't yet know what it is, but there's something special. There seems to be a local kind of horizon that makes you perceive everything that happens within this horizon of, I don't know, I have to say, whatever it is, right? But everything you see over 30 seconds has a temporal order. If that has strict temporal order, there's no relevance to the time scale. How close that temporally goes. It's just like in the spatial case, so there shouldn't be anything special about brief durations rather than long duration. Everything should just be laid out as in the spatial case, but it isn't. So these two assumptions don't work together. That's the problem, the non-locality. So what should we do about it? I'm going to discussion. Now this, so I just introduced this problem. Now I'm going to put it into a relation with philosophy of temporal experience, probably since the late 19th century, because there's something that almost all philosophers experience, the philosophers of temporal experience, including classical phenomenologists, what they all love, and this is known as the species precedent. So, what does temporal locality have to do with species? So, in the way I introduced temporal locality, I just said, and I tried to be very careful, that there's something about in a visual experience of this color change process, there's something special about brief changes. It seems that this process evolves within the horizon of brief changes, which explains why, since the brief changes only contain very, very similar color states, this explains why an obvious difference never shows up, because you only ever have these small differences. So classically, this sort of locality was seen. A famous case is the analog clock with the hour hand in the second hand. You see the hour of the second hand move. But C.D. Broad introduced this example famously, say, well, you can't see the hour hand move. I think this is not entirely correct, but this goes in the direction of temporal locality because the change is so slow. And there's something special about short time scales, like short periods. It's just they're too similar, the states of the hour hand, so you don't see it. It's more or less the same example. I just don't like the color one more for very similar. I think it's clear and simpler. But philosophers of temporal experience, I'm going to include classical phenomenologists now, went from there to the view, which is not the same as what I just said. It's not the same as perceptual comparability only across short timescales, to the view that all of human temporal experiences are limited in their size. They're quantitatively limited to a period of at most around a second. I mean, there are differences, some say half a second and a second. So what you experience is at most a process or a phenomenon of a second. So they take the phenomenon of temporal locality and they turn it into a thesis about the scope of any human temporal experience. That a human temporal experience can have at most a visual or auditory or whatever sensory representation of anything at most up to, say, a second. When that is applied to our case, the case looks like that. So these boxes are species presence in the sense that a temporal experience is really quantitatively restricted to how much it can represent any temporal experience. And I'm just assigning this the following way that, right, any pair of adjacent color states fits into one species precedent. And then there is another experience that is also restricted and that overlaps with the first in the content, but it's just another experience. It's just a new experience, and so forth, and they overlap. So what we get is this picture of how the sequence is experienced, where you have a sequence of temporal experiences with this short window, where any experience can only represent a couple of states, but they overlap in content. So that takes care of temporal locality, right? This is the standard view of temporal locality in perceptual experience. In fact, it is usually just introduced at the beginning of all discussions in temporal experience as a fact. The problem is that this view of the species present takes care of our first assumption, temporal locality, it captures that. But what about the second? Don't think, look, right? Look what you saw. You saw a process of color change that took about 20 seconds. There were no gaps in consciousness. This whole thing was phenomenally continuous. This was one, right? We were just with this one stream of consciousness of 20 seconds without gaps. Don't kid yourself. There were no gaps. The whole thing seemed continuous. And everything that you experienced during those 20 seconds seemed to have a temporal order. Frames of species present. Tell us how that works with this picture. The problem is, it seems that they can't do it because they just restricted all temporal experiences to the window of a second. But you had a 10, 20 second experience. These are just different little films. They only take a second. Their only similarity is that they partially overlap in their content, but they're just different experiences. And as the classical phenomenologists at the end of the 19th century knew very well and repeated many times over, and it's been discussed many times, is a sequence of experiences is not the same as an experience as of a sequence. This is the worst mistake you can make in this discussion because it simply ignores what needs to be explained, namely that there is a continuous experience that takes in everything that happens over 20 seconds, whereas this is just a 20-second sequence of experience. This is like showing several short films of a second in different cinemas, and then asking, so did you see the whole thing? And nobody saw it. Because all the visitors in the different cinemas just saw something over a second, and no one saw anything that took 20 seconds. So that's the problem. So how, if you like a species present, how can you respond to that? So I'm going to be quite brief because I don't want to criticize all day, but it's clear that there's a major problem. So one reaction to that is deny that we have any streams of consciousness over a longer period of time. Simply deny. So the only experiences are these very short experiences, and in fact, you're bound to say that your belief that you had an stream of consciousness over 20 seconds is a cognitive illusion. This belief is false. You're mistaken about your own conscious experience. Okay. Then, of course, following up on that, we need an account of an error theory. We need an account of where that belief comes from. But the biggest problem with that is every waking hour of our experience is evidence against this view. It seems on the face of it that we never just have second-long experiences. All my experiences since I woke up were long ones. So it's just an armchair assumption designed to capture temporal locality that we only ever have short experience. This is a theoretical assumption. This isn't given by any evidence. All the evidence we have points in another direction. Okay? The evidence we have is long experiences. I mean, hours. So denying that may be consistent and there may be a way forward, but good luck with that. Okay. So in fact, some friends of species present, most notably Barry Dainton, who wrote a whole book, the only book on streams of consciousness, take these streams seriously. But he is actually almost an exception because almost everyone else just ignores longer streams of consciousness. It's just not discussed. It's fine, we just look at experiences of the second, since things work fine there, right? But no, we need to talk about this longer. So Barry basically wants to say, now that we have these short windows, the species present, different short experiences, but then they're also, this is the outer box, they're also somehow phenomenally connected. He introduces the relation of phenomenal continuity or connectedness. Okay, this is to be taken seriously, but what the hell does that mean? We just restricted the scope of temporal experience to a second. Now you're saying, no, but they're phenomenally connected, so they're co-conscious. But you just said they're not. So what is it? You just restricted them to a second. Now you want to connect them, but not in such a way that you have an experience that simply collapses back into the space-like temporal linear sequence of all the states. So it is very, very obscure to introduce temporal continuity. And Dainton, I have to say, does not give an account of what that phenomenal continuity is. He just introduces it as a primitive and says, we need it to make sense of the connection between species present, plural, right, to get a long stream of consciousness. We can't say what it is. So I'm very unhappy about that. This is a primitive I don't understand. It is an option, but it would be so much better if we had an account that genuinely reconciles our two assumptions without restricting the scope of experience externally to a second, allowing experiences to be long experiences that represent long processes. So medium, long time scale processes, so seconds to minutes, even hours. But how? Because we want this locality and we want a sequence. So what I suggest is to address this problem not by externally restricting the scope of experience, leave the experiences in their scope and what they were, the length of process they were completely open. And let's rethink, let's reconceptualize this temporal order, so the sequential structure of the processes we experience from the ground up. Let's reconceptualize it. This is what we need to do some real work concerning the concept of temporal order to understand how it's works. So the conceptual reconstruction now, the reconceptualization that I will offer, is completely general. So it's not, this is just a consideration about temporal order, right? That I will then apply to the context of perceptual experience. Okay, so how to do it? How to do it? I'm gonna take about 15 minutes, all right, to do this.
That will be 45.
Or 20 minutes.
Okay.
So we have these color states, and intuitively they form a sequence. But it's not a strict linear order, it's not a space-like sequence, because that makes hash out of locality. So we need to reconceptualize that. So let's not even talk about sequence and order, but let's talk about these states and how they are embedded in time, in a system of time. And I will begin by introducing, for my purposes, as a primitive, the notion of an existential transition. I highlight right away that in the theory behind this, in the longer paper, I define existential transition. But I will here just take it as a primitive, because I think it is very intuitive. So when we have any states in our sequence, any color states, and we want to say, so how are they in time? The standard view, which we don't want, is, well, they are stand in a relation of earlier than. Okay? And they absolutely exist as relata of this trans-temporal relation. We reject that and instead say, no, the way they are in time, the time we perceive, the system of time we perceive is that they have an irreducibly temporal existence. They don't exist atemporally and are trans-temporally related, have an irreducible temporal existence. Some of you might immediately think, wow, present existence. But no. This has nothing to do with presentness. I won't talk about presentness at all. It has nothing to do with presentness. The irreducible temporal existence is directional. So for any states x and y, the way they are in time is that a state comes into existence or goes out of existence. These are momentary states. So it comes into existence, goes out of existence. So that's not enough because we want these states to be connected. So the primitive I'm going to work with is a state goes out of existence as another state comes into existence. This is an existential transition. Super intuitive. So one color state is replaced by the next color state. Replaced. One goes out of existence as the next color state comes into existence. And this isn't a loose thought. The next. There's an immediate transition from one to the other, but the transition involves one disappearing as the next one. So one goes out of this as the next one in our sequence. So this isn't a static sequence, this is a dynamic sequence. That's what but it is a sequence that is also, I'm not yet talking about sequence. This is a transition that is not static, but dynamic in the sense that one is replaced by the next in our process. So here's a bit of terminology. The arrow stands for transition. So something that is very important here is that in the sentence, P arrow Q, P and Q are sentences. So this is not, as in standard conceptions of a transition, a relation between states. This is not a relation that applies to states. It is a relation, it's not a relation, it is an operation that applies to proposition. So P and Q are sentences and transition is a sentence operator. And we get an existential transition when for any state x and y we get EX, what E is the existence predicate. We're just introducing that for primitive. So E exists. E goes out of existence, X goes out of existence, Y comes into existence, is what the second line expresses, right? So it's not, the transition is not a relation between X and Y. It is an operation from the existence of X to the existence of Y. It's a transition from the existence of X to the existence of Y. So what is meant by that is X goes out of existence as Y comes into existence. This is the intended reading. Very intuitive reading. X is replaced by Y. Okay, that's what this means. In a relational reading, X isn't replaced by Y because they both absolutely exist. So there's just a trans-temporal relation. Do you want to say that? No, X goes out of existence, Y comes into existence. So once we have that, we can define in a fairly obvious way an existential precedence, which again is not a relation between states, but an operation that applies to propositions. So this intuitively isn't X goes out of existence, Y comes into existence. This is X exists before Y exists. So this is the sentential counterpart of earlier than. But it isn't earlier than.
Are they connected?
Sorry?
Are they connectives? Like what you're thinking of is the symbols are connectives.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's sentence connected. Yeah. So again, we have a sentence operator sentence connective, connective, and the angle bracket now stands for obtains earlier than, obtains before, right? So for existence, this is E exists before X exists. X exists before Y exists. This is on the second line, all right? So this now can be defined in terms of existential transition. So for a state to exist before another state exists is either, so for X to exist before Y exists is either X goes out of existence as Y comes into existence, so either they're connected by an immediate existential transition or they're connected by a chain of existence. As is expressed on the lower line. So what that gives us is two different connectives. The first one has the following properties. So an existential transition is irreflexive, so no state goes out of existence as itself comes into existence. No, they're not symmetric. No state goes out of existence as another one comes into existence and vice versa. And existential transition is not transition. So when X goes out of existence and Y comes into existence, and Y goes out of existence as Z comes into existence, it's not the case that X goes out of existence as Z comes in. It is local because it's not transitive. An existential transition is a connection between a state and the next state. And it's very important that by this whole existential dimension of being replaced by, it's very intuitive that this has to be local. Right? It's a color state being replaced by the next color state. It is not replaced by the color states 5 states down. But when we chain the intransitive connection of existential transition, we get something transitive by chaining. So existential precedence is transitive because when you have X connected to Y by an existential transition, and Y connected by an existential transition to Z, X is not connected to by an existential transition to Z, but the chain, right, from X to Z, by this definition, allows us to say that X exists before Z exists. So that's transitive. What does that mean? Existential precedence has the properties that we need to get a strict linear order, but it's not a relational strict linear order, it's a non-relational operational strict linear order. So it's a strict linear order among all the states. And here's the important difference. They're not space-like order. It's rather that, so they don't have a static space-like order. What they have is a dynamically evolving order. So one state is replaced by the next state, that is replaced by the next. So one goes out of existence, the next one comes into existence, that goes out of the next one comes into existence. And as that chain continues, all of these states are connected in one unique, coherent temporal order, but it isn't the structural, space-like temporal, non-local temporal order that we had earlier in terms of the earlier than relation. It's a dynamic evolving temporal order from the first to the last. So this is just an account of temporal order as localized and as evolving, dynamically evolving. So let's take that back to our color case. So the illustration now with the brackets and the arrows stands for an existential transition. So any arrow between these bracketed states is an existential transition. So earlier we put in the context of the species present tradition, we put them into these pairs, right? Of restricted little temporal experiences, and we get the problem. Well, now they're kind of localized. This is all about short time scales, but we don't get the whole. So let's put them in the same pairs, but with our dynamic existential transition at the basis, where everything, see the big box? Everything is represented in one long temporal experience, one stream of consciousness. So what is different is it's not at all that the experience only picks out short timescales that everything is a short film. No, it's one long, but we get both the temporal locality and the temporal sequence because this temporal order is an order, a linear order, but it is localized. So it isn't based on an earlier than relation, which is non-local. The earlier than relation, like the left-up relation, does not care about timescale, doesn't care about distance. But existential transition does care about it. It's about a one state going out of distance to the next one coming into existence. And the order kind of evolves out of a chain. So when we experience the temporal process, we experience the whole 50 states, but we don't experience them in a static structure. We experience them in an evolving structure. We experience them as connected in a chain of existential transition. And the only way to experience state 37 together with state 0 is not, they're on the wall together. No, this is impossible for temporal experience. The only way to experience them is to go from 0 to 37, step by step. You can see this whole thing has to be discrete because it's a step-by-step evolution. None of this has anything to do with the present. So this isn't the present update or anything like that. It's a reconceptualization of temporal order as localized, as an evolving order on the basis of an existential transition. I mean, this is the primitive here. I didn't say anything else about it. If I had another 45 minutes, I would do that. But I'm not going to do that. Can't do it. So, our two assumptions, I'm going to recap and summarize everything and I'll be done. Our assumptions, P1 and P2, the local horizon of experience and the non-local order of experience, they are, the tension between them is resolved by rejecting P2 essentially. So the problem arises if the order is non-local. And the order is non-local when it is space-like. So when it is a classical, just strict linear order based on an earlier than relation that behaves just like the left-off relation. Where everything's just sort of there, on a directed line, and everything is perceptually comparable if you have that in front of you. So that has to be rejected. So that part of P2 has to be rejected. So everyone wants temporal locality. No one's rejecting that. So we're not going to start by saying, maybe there's nothing special about short changes in our experience. You're out of the game. Everyone accepts that. So the focus is on temporal order. That needs to be reconceptualized. This is what I just did. From a non-local conception to a localized conception, an order that allows us to talk about long sequences, whatever length you want, as evolving step by step. And for that, we need a new concept and a new foundation, which is not a relation of earlier than, but an operation of existential transition, of one thing going, one state going out of the system being replaced. Thank you.
Okay, so we're gonna start this now.
As we talk a little overwhelmed.